Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever podcast on the Jurisprudence Podcast. We thought in this lesson, or in this podcast episode, that we would just basically talk about what this is going to be about, who we are, and talk a little bit about some stuff around jurisprudence, hence why it's called What is Jurisprudence? So, in terms of who we are, I'm Alex. I'm the person who makes these lessons in jurisprudence and in law more generally. And we have here Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm a PhD researcher in criminal law and criminal theory. And I just want to point out that you were in academy mode rather than podcast
I'm
mode.
in academy mode. I'm speaking as an educator rather than a sort of a talk show host.
So we're kind of coming together as researcher and educator to talk about law.
Exactly. So, with that being said, then, I guess the point is really asking the question, what is jurisprudence? Why is jurisprudence important? What the study of jurisprudence is, and how, in a way, the reason why and our motivations for doing this podcast fundamentally involves just doing jurisprudence, fundamentally, doesn't it? That's what it essentially involves doing. And then at the end, we'll talk about some news, and essentially every single time we do a new podcast episode, we might answer some questions that were found in the comments, and we'll talk about some updates in the law. We might do special episodes that are just about, a Supreme Court case that comes out that's quite groundbreaking, or a political issue that's quite groundbreaking. I'm sure the US election is going to keep us busy for the month of October and November. All of that being said, really, let's just start talking about jurisprudence.
Yeah.
Shall we?
Okay.
So, alongside these episodes, we're also doing a blog post. We've got a Substack that I'll link in the description down below, and we essentially dive into and just sort of wax lyrical about the particular issue that we're talking about that week or that month. And so we've got one already on jurisprudence that will be available when this is available. And it's essentially talking about what jurisprudence is, the different ways that it is defined, and then talking a little bit about the theory on jurisprudence. So I think I'll probably just begin by just suggesting what jurisprudence actually is, the etymology of the word, and the sort of two major uses in which it is often cited.
I'd also like to point out that if there's anything that you're not sure about as we're talking about this, because this is very kind of ad hoc, we're having a conversation about this, that the blog post that goes alongside each episode will have more detail and you can read in your own time.
Basically, exactly. So jurisprudence, if we look at the definition, you would probably define jurisprudence as the philosophy of law, the theory of law, or legal philosophy. That's generally how, for the most part, it is used. But it also has a second definition, this idea of jurisprudence being some kind of body of law. So when we think, for example, about, let's say, Supreme Court cases and let's say US Supreme Court cases, we talk about how that this has contributed to the broader US jurisprudence, haven't we? So it seems to have two kind of definitions. It seems to have something of a theoretical definition and the sort of doctrinal definition.
Yeah.
And so from there, do you want to talk about the theory? Do you want to talk about...
So I think you've pointed out two threads that we can use the word. And in the first sense, you're talking about it as a noun. So the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And what that means then is that the judges are making decisions on points of law that are difficult, and they're referring back to principles of an ethical nature or a normative nature that provides reasons for their decisions. So then what they're doing in that sense is jurisprudence, the verb. And we separate that out in the blog post to kind of explain the difference between what you said, the doctrinal aspect and the theoretical aspect.
Yeah, the sort of pure theory of law, the idea of what law is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so if you want to peel it all the way back, then the first question was, what is law? What are the rules that we're creating to govern people? And where does it come from? So then you've got positivism and natural law.
You've got your natural law, exactly.
Yeah.
And then within there, you've got a variety of sort of subcategories. The kind of positivism that was uttered and spoken about by people like John Austin is very, very different to the kind of positivism that you see existing with people like Hart. And then obviously Hart debates with people like Dworkin. And then sort of permeating all of that, you've got the traditional ancient philosophy of natural law coming from the sort of Aristotelian tradition, developing into the people like Thomas Aquinas, who are very much natural law scholars.
Who I mentioned on the blog post as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then sort of natural law seems to take something of a break for a good few hundred years as sort of positivism begins to develop. And then it sort of comes back with people like Fuller and Finnis to an extent, doesn't it? And the interesting thing is that if you think about the sort of history, one of the things that I remember mentioning in the lessons on jurisprudence is that there is a major shift in the way philosophy of law is viewed and is sort of intellectualized, if you will, if that's even a word, when you look at the events after the Second World War. Because it seemed to be the case that one of the things that seems to happen is that there is this sort of underlying perception, if not necessarily actualized in theory, but just spoken about, this idea that there is some kind of connection between morality and the law.
Yeah.
And then the Second World War happens, and it seems to be the case that people have to reconcile with the fact that seemingly the worst things that have ever happened in human history, things like the Holocaust,
were legal,
took place under the assumption of a legal system.
Yeah.
So it's caused people to have to really reevaluate that kind of idea about natural law and about the connection and the interconnection between law and ethics and morality.
Yeah. Well, when people say things that took place in the Second World War as being legal, they mean in the doctrinal sense there were laws and legislation put in place that allowed that to happen.
Exactly, yeah.
But again, when you go back to the question of what is law, you might then say that those laws weren't actually real laws under certain principles. The legality of them wasn't justified because they were illegitimate. They contravened a standard of morality that we expect from laws, to the point where even though they were on the books, they weren't real laws.
Exactly. And so it sort of speaks to this idea of what permeates these kinds of principles is like a human rights doctrine.
Yeah.
The idea that you could fundamentally conclude from a philosophical perspective that everyone has the right to certain basic fundamental freedoms.
Yeah.
Let's say the right to life, and any law, anything that contravenes that in a non-justifiable way, like the Holocaust, like the Second World War, would therefore contravene that basic principle, that basic natural law principle of or natural rights principle, which I think Finnis or Fuller speaks about. And exactly. So even though you have the idea that the Nazis and the Third Reich actually came into being using legal processes, it came about using and utilizing the Reichstag, the German Parliament building, and actually taking power through legal means. The fact that there was this contravention of basic rights and basic principles suggests that the validity of a lot of those principles, or the validity of lots of those laws, were were questionable, or
Yeah.
were definitely questionable.
I think it's interesting that natural law sort of took a break for a while, because
Yeah.
if you think about people like Aquinas, they were theologians.
Yes.
So it's almost like there was a secularization of the law, which encouraged a shift towards positivism.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps in the pursuit of creating a kind of an egalitarian perspective on law. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think you could even just conclude that this was a societal phenomenon in Europe more generally, that the Enlightenment brought about secularization, and you obviously have this challenge to basic religious principles, and it makes a complete sense that not only does science and things like the Copernican revolution actually challenge some of the basic predilections about religion, about Christianity, but so too does that happen in law and in politics and in all these different kinds of things. And this sort of links sort of tangentially to the ways in which there was a challenge to the divine right of kings, when you've got obviously the challenge to the British monarchy, to George III in the American Revolution.
Yeah.
The same thing tends to happen in the French Revolution. The century after that, you get the Italian Revolution, you get the German Revolution, you get the Russian Revolution in 1917. All of which, of course, are challenges to basic monarchical principles, and just the sort of direction of history traveling in that way. It makes sense that law follows a similar kind of track. It follows a similar kind of process.
Yeah. Which really ties into what I've been doing recently about linking political theory to law, because the rules that govern us also are defined by what we expect of the people that govern us, and the sort of power that we allow the state to have in terms of kind of affecting their power onto the people.
Yes.
So the rules that or the principles that guide those rules are also driven by, like you say, we got rid of the divine right of kings. We have certain expectations in terms of democracy now. And there's more of a fluidity of power between the populace and the state.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So, as tangents go, that was a very fun one.
Yeah.
So fundamentally then, jurisprudence is this quite all-encompassing thing. Basically, it's this all-encompassing idea, and I guess this sort of speaks to our motivations for doing this podcast, for talking about this podcast. In the sense that obviously we're both researchers. You are a PhD researcher in law. I was a PhD researcher in international law, and so as researchers, one of the things that we're concerned about and what we enjoy doing is talking about interesting, difficult, potentially unanswered legal, political, and philosophical questions.
Yeah, critically thinking about the law and doing jurisprudence.
Exactly.
Applying the method of questioning what principles underlie the laws that are in place.
Exactly.
And defining certain things like what is violence, what is intent, what are the content of our human rights.
Yes. And I guess that in doing that, this podcast is not only us talking about things that we have some kind of authority on, and talking about things that we have some kind of expertise in, but also talking about issues that we don't necessarily have that much expertise in, that we have researched and that we have discussed and that we have developed ideas and that we've come to thinking about different principles.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see that because as we go along, we will be discussing topics that do go a little bit outside of our comfort zone in a way.
Yeah.
if it was only in our comfort zone, we'd just do episodes on crime, criminal theory, and international law.
Yeah.
Which is fun, but it would be...
I don't think we'd run out of things to say either,
No,
but
we
it would
wouldn't, no.
get a bit boring.
It might get a bit boring. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing this. But I think you said and made a point of another reason is to dispel legal misconceptions.
Yeah.
Because obviously we have a broader audience that we can talk to, and legal misconceptions are something that definitely gets a bee in your bonnet.
Yeah, I think especially in my area of criminal law, because it's such an encompassing part of law, it affects a lot of people. It has quite a significant impact on relationships and life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That there is a lot of kind of opinions floating around what should be done with regards to criminal law, what happens in the criminal justice system, and I think it's worth talking about those things and unpicking them.
Exactly. There are technical aspects of the law, especially the criminal law, that a lot of people have opinions about, but that they don't know that much about.
I mean, for example, the recent sentencing of the guy that did attacks in Nottingham.
Absolutely, yeah.
And whether it was appropriate to have the victims speaking on their perception of his sentence,
mm-hmm.
which then got taken into the media,
mm-hmm.
and then people were outraged by what was seemingly a lenient sentence.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of factors involved in making a decision about that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
His mental health, for starters, that was the whole point of giving him diminished responsibility.
Yeah, and it's the problem is that these are obviously difficult questions to navigate without seemingly outraging people.
Yeah, of course, and people definitely have a right to have an emotional response to these sorts of things.
Yeah,
but I would hope that in taking a critical approach and thinking about the broad range of factors and variables that are involved, that people can use those intuitions and that drive in a more constructive way.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really good point. That essentially, as researchers, obviously, we're very lucky to be able to research and talk about the law and educate on the law.
Yeah,
a subject that we like and we love so much, and it allows us to essentially, through this podcast, it allows us to elucidate a number of important thought processes, the way in which we digest information, the ways in which people ought to digest information to really can make the most accurate conclusions about what the law is, what it does, what it doesn't do, where it's limited at times, where you can critique it at times, and all these different things.
I think I described it in the blog post as showing you're working.
Yeah, exactly. There's the idea of showing you're working, shedding light about how to think about the law properly.
Yeah.
Properly is the sentence you used.
Thinking done properly.
Thinking done properly, exactly. And so fundamentally, then, even in talking about all this, even talking about all of these motivations, essentially what we're doing is jurisprudence.
Yeah.
That's essentially it. Hence why it's called the Jurisprudence Podcast.
And I think we're going to end up saying that a heck of a lot of times.
Yeah, exactly.
Today.
Exactly. We're doing jurisprudence.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the general structure, the way in which we thought about doing this is talking about lots of different things, obviously, but we each have our own interests. We each have our own things that we want to talk about. And the aim here is that each week or every 2 weeks is what we do is that each of us take it in turns to pick a topic, to do research on a topic, and then to come to this podcast and talk about that topic to the other person, and then have a discussion about that topic.
Yeah.
So we've got a few ideas already that we want to do. We will obviously also, do a number of other things. So like for for example, there is a Supreme Court case or an ICJ opinion that's particularly groundbreaking or particularly influential that people want to talk about, then we will talk about that. Where there's potentially a political issue that has legal implications, we'll talk about that. Go on.
There might also be scope for suggestions.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, 100%.
Because we were considering having a Q&A section at the end. We greatly encourage engagement. But if there's something that really stands out to us, we might even make a whole week to a certain subject.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the next couple of episodes are pretty much locked in already.
Yeah.
So next episode, I want to talk about the advisory opinion regarding the occupied Palestinian territory, the ICJ opinion that came out a few days ago. That'll be a fun one.
That's very much your remit as well.
Yeah, exactly. That'll be a fun one. And then we'll talk about things like sentencing guidelines. We'll talk about some theoretical stuff as well. We've got some theoretical things on here that we want to look at. And we will also do, where there isn't any news, or where there's no news that necessarily merits a full episode, or where we've not spent that much time talking about things, we will do a news story that's quite interesting. That's in the
sort of
news.
a news roundup.
Exactly. So if you have any questions, okay, make sure you put them down in the description below. If you have any suggestions for topics that you might want us to talk about, make sure you put that down in the description below. We'll definitely get onto all of those, and we will be making these episodes weekly, bi-weekly, every fortnight, all these different kinds of things. Basically, as and when new things develop as well.
I think it's also important as part of this project that there is an ongoing conversation between everyone and us. So it's not just us deciding what we talk about, but also what interests other people.
Exactly, 100%.
And what people want to know about.
Exactly.
Encouraging a critical dialogue about the law.
Yeah, and I think as well, the final point I want to make before talking about some news that's going to be quite interesting for people, is that we are obviously researchers. Don't take everything that we say to be a 100% bona fide truth. Because we can be wrong. We're often wrong. We're always wrong about all kinds of things. It's actually one of the things I actually want to do is encourage being wrong more often, because I feel like what happens in debates these days is that there is this sort of dispelling, or this idea that you shouldn't be wrong. You have to be correct about everything. You have to have an opinion about everything.
You have to win.
And you have to win, exactly. So if we're wrong about something, and we will be wrong, or even if we're not necessarily wrong, but you just disagree and you think our opinion's stupid, then put it in the comments and we'll talk about it. We'll encourage this kind of dialogue for everyone to get involved as well.
Yeah, I'd happily have a back and forth, and
you would as well. Yeah.
Well, not in like an argumentative sense, but in a
boxing ring.
Yeah. Yeah, go the full 12 rounds.
Exactly.
No, I'd happily have a back and forth about a topic that I'm interested in, because that's the whole point of having a dialogue. Learning from other people, learning new perspectives. I'm the first person to admit that I'm wrong about something.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Because I think that's the only way that you can learn. Because if you come from a position of, I already know everything about this topic, you probably don't.
No. Which
is what we were talking earlier, and we said people who are willing to say that they're lacking in knowledge about a certain topic probably know a heck of a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're aware of where the gaps are, and they're aware of where they need to go next.
Yes.
So
there we go.
Be willing to be wrong is the message.
Yes. Well, with that then, let's talk about some news. We've talked about jurisprudence.
Yeah.
We've talked about what this podcast is. Let's talk about some news that's been going on right now. The time of recording this, it is the 2nd of August, 2024.
Yeah.
And the biggest story, probably, at least in England and Wales, English and Welsh law, is this debate concerning terrorism and terrorist legislation and terrorist movements. So, do you want me to just do a bit of the background, because I know that you're very much.
Should we start with the?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll do a bit of the background, and then you can really take the lead on this, because this is one of your areas of expertise.
Oh no.
So
Go on.
So there's basically two stories that are sort of working in tandem with each other, isn't there? And the first of these stories is relating to quite heavy, actually the heaviest sentences ever, I believe, for Just Stop Oil protesters for blocking and trying to cause gridlock on the M25 in order to try and promote this idea of preventing the government from doing North Sea drilling and oil.
I would like to point out that their sentence was conspiracy to cause a public nuisance for coordinating direct action protests on the M25.
Okay.
So they themselves weren't the people
that were there. They were the people that organised and organised this protest.
So the conversation is sort of twofold. There's the people that actually did the disruption, and there's the people that helped coordinate it.
Yes, exactly. And then the sort of tangential story relates to the Southport riot. So, for those of you who've been living under a rock, there was an attack on a number of children it was in Southport, I assume. Yeah. And obviously this is a horrific attack, led to a number of these children dying, and a number of them are still in critical condition. And as a result of sort of general misinformation online, people believing that this individual was an immigrant, or that this person was an illegal immigrant, or these kinds of different things, that it led to a riot of what would be described as far-right individuals, the English Defence League, these kinds of things. And then the debate now has arisen about whether or not we should be prescribing the English Defence League under terrorism legislation, under terrorism laws, or is that a terrorist organisation? And of course, this is an ongoing and almost a debate that is as long as time, as old as time, isn't it? So I'm going to then move it over to Charlotte and let her talk about terrorism legislation.
Okay.
And the story. Just whatever your thoughts are on this story, okay?
Well, I'll start with the Just Stop Oil thing.
Okay.
Because when we brought these two pieces of news together, we started talking about really what is appropriate protesting. And because these two stories are about basically public order and ensuring safety in the public and terrorism. And normally these two things are not connected. And at least legally, I think in terms of theoretically and thinking about them in that way, you could say that terrorism is, as it is defined, it is something that is designed to intimidate the public or a section of the public.
Yes.
And action that falls under that category is something that endangers life, creates a serious risk to health or safety, or is designed to seriously interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system. So that's about like cyber
You're
attacks.
the Terrorism Act there.
I'm quoting the Terrorism Act 2000 there.
Yeah.
Section 1.
Yes.
So this idea of disruption and intimidation of the public brings in a question of what is considered violence.
Yes. Well, this is the debate that we had, isn't it? Because nobody would disagree that the EDL riot was violent, because of course it led to I think a van being set on fire. It led to about 20 or so police riot officers being injured. I don't believe anyone was necessarily seriously injured, but it was still obviously people attacking, people throwing stones, people throwing bricks, all kinds of stuff like that, which is obviously obviously a form of violence. And then that's the sort of colloquial perception.
Oh no, never mind.
That was the sort of colloquial perception, and then the other perception is that, well, blocking the M25, that surely isn't violent. That's surely not a violent act at all. And so the general point that people tend to make is, why is it that the Just Stop Oil people have been given very harsh sentences for what is seemingly peaceful protest versus the EDL individuals who, I mean, obviously at the time of recording, this hasn't gone to court or anything.
No,
but
because it was quite recent.
Yeah, but the general perception is that far-right riots, okay, and far-right violent riots in all their forms, in the last 10 or so years, aren't treated as harshly as people who are protesting climate change, or protesting a lack of effort being formed on climate change.
Yeah, and now we're seeing a shift towards the EDL potentially being a prescribed group, which means that it is illegal to be a member of the EDL if that went ahead.
Yes.
And it also carries with it significant sentencing uplifts if you are arrested in relation to potential membership or inciting support and violence on behalf of a prescribed group. So I pointed out earlier that there was a petition that went around in 2014 encouraging the prescription of the EDL.
So for those just for those of you who don't know, there is a system in the UK's political system called e-petitions, where you can anyone can create a petition to Parliament, and if they get 10,000 signatures, then the House of Commons Parliament will respond to that petition. If it gets 100,000 signatures, then they will debate it in Parliament itself. And this is sort of seen as a way of trying to get open democracy, trying to see that Parliament is linking itself and responding to some of the needs of the people. And the reality is that e-petitions don't really do anything.
No.
But at least the perception is that this is a more democratic system, and it's sort of promoting democracy.
I would be a little less cynical, I think, because if it gets like 10,000, the thresholds are, if it gets 10,000 signatures, it warrants a response.
And then 100,000 is a debate in Parliament.
Yeah. So usually it's unlikely that it'll receive 100,000 signatures and end up being debated.
No.
But then when it does, I think one example was the legal recognition of non-binary identities. That went to Parliament, and they just sort of did a one and done, we're not going to do this, end of, and then closed, and that was the debate on that, basically, which I was quite disappointed about. They didn't, go into very much detail. So it really depends on what you expect in terms of that.
Exactly. It depends on what your expectations are. If it's that
makes
sense.
Anyway, the point of me bringing this up was there has been an eye on the EDL for a very long time.
Yeah.
It's been quite well known in British politics and socio-cultural issues that we have this very right-wing, bigoted, anti-immigration group that is quite racist.
Yeah. No one would even deny that.
No.
Hopefully not. Even the EDL would deny that.
Well, yeah. One of the reasons why these riots happened was because misinformation was spread on social media about the
immigration status
and that the person was Muslim.
Yeah.
So then they started rioting outside a mosque.
Yes, they did. Yes, that's true.
So my point was that, has the EDL fundamentally changed in nature to go from the government's response in 2014 that the terrorism legislation is saved for the prescription of groups concerned in terrorism. So concerned in the definition that I provided earlier, to now not just being violent, thuggish individuals coming together to put forward like a racist narrative into an organization of terrorist action.
Yeah. So I think that if we were to take this from a strictly legal sense, a strictly legal perspective, in 2014, the government responded to the petition and they said, we recognize that the EDL are thuggish, they might be extremists or whatever.
Yeah.
However, the terrorism legislation is prescribed only for people who are concerned in terrorism.
Yeah.
And so the assumption there, the implication there is that we don't believe in 2014 that the EDL were
a terrorist group.
A terrorist group. They weren't acting in a way that was concerned in terrorism. And now there has been a shift such that there is this idea that they might eventually, or there is definitely the perception from the government now that they might be prescribed as a terrorist group. So if that is the case, then it has to have been the case that, at least legally, something has happened from 2014 to now in 2024 to essentially allow it to be concerned in terrorism. To essentially be concerned in terrorism. And the question is, has the EDL changed in any kind of
meaningful way?
In a meaningful way to go from being just a thuggish group of rioters that aren't concerned in terrorism to now being concerned in terrorism. And that's why I asked the question of whether or not this idea of prescribing this group under the terrorism legislation is less about the specific legal definition, but more about the political implications of prescribing it as a terrorist group.
Yeah.
After this very, very public, very, very violent riot, is it a terrorist group because of it's changed in terms of the law?
Yeah.
Is it a terrorist group because it should have always been prescribed as a terrorist group?
Yeah. Back
in 2014. Or is it a terrorist group now because we're using the word terrorist for political reasons, essentially? That's the question.
Yeah. Well, I would put forward an additional option in that we're viewing the terrorism legislation in a different way.
Yes.
And it sort of links to the idea of it serving a political purpose. And links in the Just Stop Oil issue as well, in that we're seeing a blending together of public order policing and terrorism, anti-terrorism policing.
Yes.
So even though there is a recommendation for these two things to be kept separate from the independent terrorism reviewer, and this might be a separate kind of episode in itself coming up. It seems to me that this reactionary approach to issues like this has made the government more inclined to what's the word?
More inclined to utilize terrorism.
Yeah, like more inclined to blur the lines a little bit.
To blur the lines between public order and terrorism.
Because we're thinking about serious disruption or serious endangerment to life. And arguably that's what the Just Stop Oil activists did.
Yes, because if you block a motorway, then that can cause serious danger to life.
Yeah.
Because if there's ambulances on the motorway, there are people in those ambulances, the people can't get anywhere because of Just Stop Oil, then obviously that's going to cause people to die.
Yeah.
And then we made the point that if we were to hypothetically take two scenarios where you have a Just Stop Oil protest like that and an EDL riot like that, you could conceivably have a situation where the EDL riot causes some injuries, but that the Just Stop Oil protest causes people to die, causes more death. And you would theoretically assume that means that there's the stakes are raised in the Just Stop Oil protest compared to an EDL riot, which then it sort of blurs the line, and it sort of, or it either blurs the line or it reduces the utility of the word violent and violence in that regard, doesn't it?
And terrorism.
Exactly. Everything just gets more useless.
Sort of mashing them together in this way, it removes the distinctiveness of terrorism, such that it is no longer this sort of elevated, high risk thing to something that becomes more ubiquitous in its use.
Yeah.
And this is something that I've been looking at more recently as well, in terms of counter-terrorism policing and the sorts of justifications used for things like stop and search, and more impositions on individual liberty in terms of questioning people, that sort of thing. When you involve the word terrorism, you waive people's rights, because it's seen as a justly proportional means to the end of preventing something so serious.
Exactly.
So while we're talking about this, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad idea to prescribe the EDL.
No.
Because we're seeing a shift towards prescribing more right-wing groups, and I think that is correct. It has been the case for a long time that we've seen a surge in neo-Nazi groups and extreme right-wing violent activity, which also, as is mentioned in the article that I pulled up here for looking at, a transgression of our fundamental values in society. It is fundamentally anti-democratic, fundamentally inciting violence and creating this kind of lack of security in public is terrorist.
Yeah. So it's sort of concluding this then. So even though you're critical of terrorism legislation, and I'm sure we will do an episode where we talk about why you're critical of terrorism legislation in this country, if we are to use, I think your point is that if we're going to use terrorism legislation the way we have been for the last 20 years, then the EDL should be prescribed, or you see nothing wrong necessarily in them being prescribed.
Yes.
But then obviously you have a problem with the way we've been using terrorism legislation in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the sort of point that you would make, is that, even though you have problems with the legislation, if we're going to apply it in a way that we have been applying it, then they should be prescribed as terrorist organization.
Yes. Yeah, I think that rounds off that one. I think that they're not wrong in considering it, and I think that they should have considered it a lot sooner. But I think when viewing these two cases side by side, it's interesting that we're seeing an increase in censure on disruptive action on behalf of climate change as well. So it's almost like we're seeing a shift in terms of more serious kind of sentencing and punishment for this kind of disruptive activity.
So do you think that Just Stop Oil should be prescribed?
No. But that's an interesting question, actually, because my response is based on my intuition.
Yeah.
That their cause isn't itself extremist. Well, depends on how you define extremist as well.
Yeah, of course.
Is it that their ideology itself is extremist? Or is it just that their actions in pursuing that ideology is extremist?
Yeah.
By contrast,
or at least extreme.
Yeah.
I guess there's quite a lot of intuition that's pumped into the word extremist.
Yes.
But the word extreme, I think anyone can conclude that their actions are extreme.
Extreme, yes.
But yeah.
By contrast, you could say that the EDL have extremist ideology.
100%. Yeah.
In terms of anti certain groups. I would also like to point out your, just as rounding off, I mentioned anti-democratic. You said that a proper way of approaching.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this whenever we do talk inevitably about Just Stop Oil, because they're not going to go away, fundamentally, and
No.
the government needs to deal with climate change properly.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that protest,
Demonstration.
that demonstration, the blocking of the M25 that got so many of them locked up for some very, very long sentences, was in protest of North Sea oil drilling.
Yeah.
Which is something that the current and the new Labour government has dropped anyway. So it feels like their protest or their demonstration wasn't particularly effective. What was more effective is going out to the ballot box and voting, which is obviously a very liberal interpretation, and me being a very liberal person, liking basic liberal values, makes sense. But it seems that in terms of, I'm sure one day we will talk about the efficacy and the extent to which Just Stop Oil are actually doing a good job in their activism, because I think that has to tie into it. Because I think, like, obviously their end goals, their cause is a noble cause, and a cause that is very, very much one that we should all be more concerned about. Obviously, they should probably also admit that their methods are, if not extreme, they are at least novel and unique, and are something that we haven't seen in this country for a very long time.
Yeah.
But the question is, does it work? We should surely think about this from a sort of consequentialist perspective. Does it actually cause and leads to better,
effective change,
effective climate policy?
Yeah.
Or does it actually hinder climate debates? But the problem with that is, we would just be jumping on the bandwagon of debating Just Stop Oil rather than debating climate change.
Yeah.
Because their points that they have always made is that, why are we talking about us? We should be talking about
the real problem.
Drilling of oil, or the it was Insulate Britain, was it? That was the sort of prior organisation. And so the deflection away from the major problem is probably something that they aren't particularly very happy about when we talk. So I'm sure we will do an episode wrapping all of that up and talking about that in a lot more detail.
Yeah.
And discussing it.
But I think what's interesting is, in the sentencing, the judge said, you have made yourselves an arbiter for what is to be done about climate change, such that you're taking away people's democratic right to exercise their individual liberties on this matter.
I agree with that.
And that's why they got such severe sentences, because, again, it goes back to violating these fundamental principles in our society of allowing people to make decisions for themselves.
Yeah.
When you block up a very major road, you're disrupting people's lives, but you're also forcing them to take part in their demonstration, whatever that cause may be.
Yeah, that you're taking away their free will. Yeah.
But is it right for organizers of that to have 5 years in prison? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, answer in the comment section below. I think that wraps up, doesn't it? Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a good way to put it.
We've wasted your time, basically, talking about this and not actually coming up with an answer.
Well, I don't think the point is to find an answer, because
this is jurisprudence.
This is jurisprudence. The idea of coming, I think, at the end of the day, there is something that should have been done, and the fact that they were sentenced for public nuisance, inciting to cause public nuisance, is correct.
Yes.
The intricacies of how severe that sentence should be is up for debate.
Yeah.
And I believe that the arguments passed by the judge were valid ones. Whether they hold as much weight as is necessary to justify those very severe sentences is another question, and up for people to talk about. But that's basically the crux of what this podcast is about, is looking at these kinds of things and having a conversation about moving the line, talking about what sort of factors are involved,
Exactly.
and that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree completely.
Do you want to round up then?
Yeah, I think that's round up the first episode. We've talked a little bit about jurisprudence, and we've talked quite a lot about terrorism and talking about the riots and various different responses to this. Stay tuned for another episode that we'll do on international law next.
Yep.
On Israel-Palestine, which I'm sure is going to be very, very fun. Indeed. If there are any questions or any points that you want to make, leave them in the comments down below, and we'll respond to all of them. Remember to look in the description. We've linked the Substack post talking about jurisprudence on the Substack that's come out at the same time. And yeah,
I think we'll also link the 2 articles.
Yeah, we'll link the 2 articles as well on the riots and stuff like that as well. So yeah, stay tuned for another episode.
Yep.
Definitely.